Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Enhanced Succession Planning webinar. Today we'll be discussing the components of succession planning and how to use competencies and assessments to identify and develop high potential employees. I'm Heath O'Leary, the Vice President at ThinkWise. We also have with us Taha Alithi, the Director of Client Services at ThinkWise. Taha will be running the technical aspects of the webinar, including collecting your questions throughout the presentation. Please use the comments section on the right side of your screen to submit questions, and we'll address those in a short Q&A session following the presentation. Also, we have two poll questions during the presentation that we'll be asking, where we ask for your feedback to help drive some additional discussion. So please take part in those as well. With that, let me introduce our presenter, Steve Griffin, the President at ThinkWise, to kick things off.
Thanks, Heath, and good morning, everyone. As Heath mentioned, the team here at ThinkWise, I just want to give a little bit about us, and then we can get started. So ThinkWise has been around for about 10 years now, evolving from a high-end consulting company into an assessment and learning software company. So we've made that transition a number of years ago from consulting then to computer-based technology. ThinkWise is really founded on the notion that science needs to be real, available, and simple. And I think we've achieved that, and we'll get to some of the solutions much towards the end after today's content. And we'll dive into using competencies and assessments, as Heath had mentioned with today's conversation. So as we go through today, we have an agenda for everyone. We'll go through the components of succession planning, defining some critical competencies, not necessarily defining the competencies that you must use necessarily, but just understanding the idea that competencies are important. Also measuring and developing high potentials or HIPOs, and then some benchmarks for success. And as we wrap it up, we'll get to some Q&A if we have some time available. I already mentioned a little bit about ThinkWise. This is just a real quick overview of some of the solutions. I had mentioned some key things that we make sure that the products are real and available and based on science. And we have some of our great partners that leverage our products that are out there in the marketplace for you to take a look at. And if you haven't looked at our website lately, certainly check that out as well. I want to start by reviewing succession planning as a process. A lot of folks tend to look at succession planning as an event, that it's one thing and you get it done, you get it over with, whether it's gone from a napkin and a pen and a dinner, or leveraging a computer, that it's something that you just do and move on, and it's more than that. It's something that's very involved. You have to have a lot of folks entrenched and believe in what you're doing. Otherwise, you're going to see quite a bit of failure. So you see three strategies on your computer screen for addressing succession planning, and they can really range. These are just some broad level strategies, from external searches to internal development and promoting from within, which tends to be high success rates when it's internal, as well as some disciplined internal succession planning and purposeful development process. You'll also see some basic steps that are there that you have, from defining the roles that require succession planning. We'll dive into that a little bit, because not every role may need a succession plan, especially if some of those roles are highly available. In recruiting or just externally, those roles tend not to need a succession plan, but it doesn't mean you leave those folks out. Also, for each role, you want to go through and define the 3 to 5 key experiences those candidates need to have to define who is ready now. And ready now can be up to as far as the definition, to the business. Some folks literally want someone ready now, and that helps define succession. It's not necessarily the most successful, but that's how they'll define it. But ready now tends to be anything from six months to even 2 years. So they're ready now in the sense that they're ready to go through a bit of a growth spurt from a business perspective, monitored, managed, and recognized for the work that they're doing, and then they can go through that successor profile. Each role will have a definition or defined 3 to 5 high-level competencies. You're more than likely going to find success with that small amount. When you start going over 5, it's what's that 6th one, or why do we have 7? And unfortunately, you're going to get high failure rates in succession planning when someone has to pay attention to 10 or 12 things to manage and monitor over the next year or so, in addition to the job that they have. And lastly, you want to cluster those roles with similar experiences and competency requirements so that you can manage that process much easier. Well, these are some basic steps. They're often overlooked, I think, because organizations are either impatient with the process or at times they're driven with a short-term focus rather than long-term strategy. This is more or less, it's HR's responsibility to look at something like this as the vision for people, so to speak, and that now needs to be mapped to business. I believe that succession plan needs to be very slow, steady. It's a process. It needs to be done with a methodical mindset, but at the same time, not overcomplicated, and we'll get into that a little later. One of the ways that it can get overcomplicated is politics. Politics can certainly put a damper on things. As we went over the high-level overview, we're now going to get into what the defining roles are. So you have corporate critical roles. I think critical roles are also overlooked by many companies. This is similar to looking at your business to determine how you either make money or supply great service to customers, patients, consumers, or what have you. There are certain functional roles that I think that are so critical. Companies fail, though, when they don't understand how those roles support the mechanics of the business. And take an example, a group that's often overlooked is environmental services, right? That's the janitors and folks that clean the office space. But if that particular business needs accreditation or they're required by some certain legal standard to have just a very clean environment free of bacteria, diseases, and you name it, and if those roles are overlooked, you're going to fail at succession planning. So I think for certain jobs, for instance, environmental services is likely going to be super critical to maintain certain regulations, say in restaurants or hospitals. Yet we're often, we tag the chef or the server in restaurants as being the most critical. And not that they're not important, but this could be true for different restaurants too in different regions, that they need to have a certain mindset to not copy their counterparts, because restaurant X says that they have to have the best chef in the area, therefore that we need to in order to be competent or competitive. But what they need to do instead is truly understand what makes their restaurant particularly unique versus trying to copycat someone else. On this slide, we have this, I think, a pretty important graphic that looks at kind of the wheel as far as the employee development is concerned, and at that center is important to pay attention to. And this is the organizational competency model, and it tells you something that's pretty important here, that the essential behaviors that align each stage of your employee development. And no matter where you start, whether you're starting with leaders and succession planning or you're starting from the front end and you're going from hiring, it's very important that competencies are successful throughout the employee life cycle as far as its utilization. I think competencies are most successful, though, when they float into each of the areas that you have here that kind of integrate into an employee's life. This not only informs employees of expectations and rewards, but it also is going to inform their culture. Competencies are going to fail when there's just a list of behaviors taped to a wall, or they work only at one time of the year when you're doing performance reviews. If that's the only time that competencies are actually brought up, it's just a disaster of a process for everyone. And we know those organizations. We've worked in those organizations too, and we know that we don't like them, but it's important to certainly call out, I think. Here you have the identification of critical competencies. So from our perspective, there are numerous competencies that you can choose. What you need to pay attention to as far as succession planning, you're looking at defining 3 to 5 behavioral competencies for each critical role and making sure that they're future focused, right? That's that bullet right there, that they're future oriented. If you end up defining competencies on what makes you good right now, you've dated everyone in the succession plan. And by the time they're done, they've kind of worked themselves out of a job because the business has evolved. So it's for everyone's benefit that you truly look at the strategic direction of the business on a 3 to 5 year outlook, and then bring in and complement succession planning. There isn't one magical competency. I'm not sure if everyone signed up hoping to hear that necessarily, but there isn't one that's going to make your world better at work. People are unique creatures. We're complicated. We're messy. Competencies help put some structure to that at work, but they're not a cure-all necessarily. When you leverage good competencies, that means that you're taking note that these are what's most critical as far as how everyone needs to behave at work as far as the definition of success. If there was only one way to do something, we would never see innovation, and there would be no creativity at work. We would also get very bored at work. So it's important that you bring in a diverse set of competencies with those 3 to 5, just to help everyone, I think, grow towards pushing that company for that 3 to 5 year outlook. Just want to take a quick pause and just get everyone's blood going a little bit, but let's get into the first poll question. You're going to see it on your screen here. Which of the following do you use to identify critical roles within your organization? You have 4 different responses here that I'm going to ask you to pick one. So do you hire externally? Are your executives the ones that are responsible to determine those critical roles? Do you develop critical business scenarios to highlight the need? Or do you look to your HR department to review critical knowledge versus what's available in the market? So go ahead and just take a couple of minutes. We've got a couple of people that have already started going through that. I'll give you about another minute, and then we'll start taking a look. All right, so we got about half people so far, maybe about 30 seconds. We'll get a few more people coming through. All right, so let's take a look. It's pretty evident right here where majorities say that the executives are responsible to determine the identification of critical roles in the organization, and that's great. The responsibility as well as sponsorship should come from the executive, so that's a very good sight to see. Followed up by internal HR tends to be the responsible partner here looking at the landscape, so to speak. And then a few of you have an external strategy group that they may have an HR background or business consulting background that tend to look at what the critical roles are likely in a very particular industry. So that's good to see that majority of folks have the responsibility and onus on the executives to do that. So moving on, everyone has seen a slide very similar to this. It's a 9-box that tends to look at the 3x3 card of performance and potential, and you have the axes going from low to high. These aren't necessarily the definitions that everyone needs to follow or whatnot, and they're certainly not a credit to ThinkWise. These are very common for HR and consultants to use. You have high performance and then high potential, and then meets expectations and develop. Those tend to be the folks that you'll find in a succession planning pool as far as who's available. They're very standard as far as a 9-box is concerned, but they're worth spending time with since they force people to visualize the calibration process. I think it's too easy to say, you know, Gene's doing a great job, but compared to who? I'm pretty sure most executives are going to say everyone's doing at least a good job. That's not a helpful response in a 9-box scenario. So for Jane, she's doing a good job. Again, it's compared to who, and do you see her developing further in her current role or a future one? And that's where a 9-box is concerned. We're looking at very future-focused roles here. I think the concept of a 9-box has more to do with the conversation that occurs than it is the outcome of plotting talent. across the board of performance and potential. It's great as an outcome that talent is plotted, but the real work is the conversations that happen across leaders. For the most part, this is the first opportunity that executives across an organization really sat down to start discussing who is doing what, how well they're doing, and getting feedback from their peer executives on observations of talent. That this tends to be the first time that happens. So I think the conversation that happens is, if it's not as valuable, for me, it's actually more valuable that happens, because I think they start after the visualization of the talent, they start to focus on owning the development that happens after the experience. So to get, I guess, psychological just for a second, I think the process is good. Typically it's referred to as a metacognitive process. This is where you're thinking about thoughts, right? Pondering. This is where people journal and they're documenting their thoughts. So here you're starting to challenge yourself about talent. You're having a great group conversation, and at times even a debate about performance and potential across the organization. It becomes a pretty gratifying experience, I think, for executives because they can successfully attach the right people to strategic moves in the organization. This is also a mentally challenged experience. Don't force it. It's going to take time. This isn't something you do over the course of hours. This is something that can be done over the course of a week, if not multiple weeks, just for a single business unit. Because at times what this is going to do is highlight that maybe 50 to 80% of the talent can be plotted. The rest of the talent that needs to be put into a very particular spot is an external search. So I think it's important that you take your time in going through this process. Measuring, developing high potentials. Here what we're talking about is assessments and surveys and various feedback tools that can happen. What assessments do and what they don't do. So what do assessments do? They're great. They help you understand talent. They help cover what the strengths are, the challenges, where they're going to be good as far as certain stressful situations and where barriers may exist to success. And that's very good from a high level. But now you have to figure out there's 360s, there's personality assessments, there's motivation tools, there's assessment centers and various performance review products that are out there. So keep in mind that there's not a single tool that's going to predict success at the next level. Personality assessments have zero prediction as far as who's going to be successful for 2 roles from now. They're going to be able to predict maybe at a very small increment who has potential for the next level, but a very small increment. 9 boxes and succession planning is really about who's ready for a role with 2 jumps. So a manager to a vice president. So they're potentially jumping a director role. And that director role becomes part of their action planning and part of their development in order to prep for a VP role. You're not going to find a personality assessment that's going to predict that kind of a jump. So assessments do allow the business, though, to understand talent better. So it's not a knock on personality assessments. They're going to be required. They're going to help you align development opportunities better, letting you know where people are highly motivated and skilled, and also highlight where the limitations and barriers are too. So where personality assessments help have a lot to do with identification of key underlying characteristics, right? Because personality factors are underlying, they're enduring, and they last the test of time, so to speak. They're going to highlight, I think, the grit that someone has, and mental horsepower, and their drive. At a high level, that's great. But now you need feedback on how well people are doing across some of the factors that you're measuring. And that's where competencies and 360s come into play. So personality assessments, they leave much on the table, though, if they were done in isolation. And this is like what I mentioned, it's where 360s come into place, because they help improve the assessment process, I think, greatly. 360s help alleviate some of the problems associated with personality assessments, because you're rallying all these raters and observers around the participants of your succession planning to get feedback on how well and informing how well these people are doing around expected behaviors. And those are competencies that we're talking about. They're going to provide a real-life snapshot of how well people are doing and what barriers observers see that are in the way of that leader's success profile. So when you accompany all that rater feedback with a personality assessment, you're really bringing in a rich amount of data to help inform that 9-box experience. I wouldn't jump into a 9-box necessarily without assessment data, and I think that's where a lot of 9-box experiences fail, because they'll rely on subjective information by a leader who may bulldog a calibration meeting, or you rely on performance review data. And performance review data, as we know, the research from a lot of folks from Person to Aon will tell you that performance review, as far as feedback is concerned, in and of itself, it's lacking in a lot of areas. For the most part, people are lazy. That our brain is not the most efficient organ that we own. People in the room are laughing a little bit, but it's true. We need a highly disciplined set of tools, process. We need time as far as giving feedback. It's not something you just grab somebody and go through really quickly to get it over with. And I think leaders are often given too much responsibility as far as people. You'll notice research out there on where span of control is. Healthcare, you can see it. One leader may be to 50. But where the research tends to show is when you start exceeding 12, the value of the team starts to diminish. Communication goes really south, and that leader tends to be overwhelmed with providing the right amount of feedback to everyone when you exceed 12 people. In a perfect world, it would be around 8. But not every organization is really set up to succeed that way. So as we continue in our measurement conversation around developing high potentials or high pos, we'll dive into 360s a little bit. A lot of us are familiar with personality assessments, and ones that are out there that tend to get leveraged often in succession planning are like the CPI, the 16PF, the Hogan Personality Inventory. Those tend to be some of the mainstays that are out there, maybe even the NEO. But as far as 360s are concerned, you really need to focus on learning 2 to 3 critical competencies. The selection of those competencies need to come from the executives, not HR. HR are highly skilled at what products are available, what solutions are out there to leverage, but the executives are the ones that have the vision for the organization and need to be part of that facilitation process on adopting what those competencies are. And we offer a competency modeling as far as a software tool. Everyone's familiar with CardSort, but it's a software world now, so you can leverage ThinkWise competencies in an online environment and leverage our competency modeling tool in having the executives debate which ones are highly critical versus essential versus what I would call a junk drawer. They may be good to have, but we really don't need to pay attention to, right? We all have that drawer. So it allows the executives, once again, to focus on what is really critical for succession as it relates to succession. Again, map to the vision of the company. And then we'll talk about some micro-learning that occurs too. Speaking of learning, though, focused learning, I think, is what we want to talk about. Focused learning has more to do with intentional projects, not necessarily monitoring the person's performance for another year and seeing how well they do. It's really defining intentional projects for that person, because they're going to have a greater impact on the business. They're going to be stretch goals for that leader, but you want to make sure you're not going to over-design a project. You want to make sure it's a fire in the business. It actually exists. You don't have to design a fire. You want to make sure that that person's highly challenged. It's not necessarily something that's easy to accomplish either. What I would do is look for various challenges, or what I was calling fires in the business that exist, like a failing sales unit. It doesn't matter if the person does or doesn't have a background in sales. If it's really about the people, that person needs to go from HR and into sales and learn that business unit anyway, if they're going to be a leader, in two spots up, and try to get those folks or a new set of folks in to really lift that sales unit up. So I would highly suggest that you look for intentional projects, but I'm defining intentional as there are real life challenges that are occurring in the business now, not necessarily designed to make someone happy and feel like you like them. You know, that's where things are going to be terrible. This is a slide we'll spend a little bit of time on. These are some benchmarks for success, and you can tweak them as you see fit in your organization or your business unit. So the 4 that we have up there are some metrics to pay attention to, such as the first one, right? It's 80% of your candidates are internal. If you can, I mean, I would say define a benchmark for yourself, and you can start doing that by looking, you know, at an HR autopsy. Go back and start looking at where do your candidates tend to come from for your critical roles. And HR typically has that data, so go and leverage that information. And it probably has never been leveraged before. So where are you finding candidates typically? Are they being promoted from within? Are you looking externally? Are you leaning on the executives to figure it out and you're not sure where they come from, right? Leaving the executive recruiters in the dark maybe inside the organization. But I think a solid benchmark is looking at succession plan being filled with about 80% of your current incumbents. The next one is attrition rate. Now HR, you know, we're always looking at attrition from a number of ways, but here you want to monitor attrition of your succession candidates. So if you have 10 people that are considered part of your high potential group, how much are you losing them? You know, as far as they're being lost to another company. It's different if they got promoted. You didn't lose them. That's part of the succession planning process. So that's actually a plus. But I would at least, if you don't have anything as far as attrition, make sure that you can keep at least 50. Now, go back. If you only have 10 people in your succession plan, try to look at maybe 15. So is some of that external, or you bringing in some internal candidates that you think are going to be quick learners and they're very driven. Maybe you want to throw them in that succession planning pool to see how well they do over time. But try to get less than half of your pool moving on to another organization. It'd be great in a perfect world to keep them all, but at least start with 50 and see where that goes. You may want to adjust that over time. The next is set up a compensation plan that's very unique and very specific. You've already designated these folks as being high potential. In other words, they're so unique, they're not like everyone else. That's what a succession plan is. So for me, it's call a spade a spade. They're unique, therefore compensation needs to be unique. If you set high potentials on the same compensation plan as everyone else, they're going to be part of that attrition rate in the second bullet. So I highly encourage that you have differentiated compensation treatment for your high potentials. If not, you've pretty much told them that you're high potential and you're not worth it. So make sure they marry as far as your high potential. We value you through some financial as well as developmental opportunities and gains. And then lastly, assess the rate of promotion. So high potentials should experience anywhere from two to three times the rate of promotion or job change compared to other folks. See how well that is happening. And it's not necessarily you're failing if they're not, but it should be an indicator of how well you're doing your succession planning. Specifically as a tool or a process, it's that 9-box calibration process. How well is that actually happening? And this should be a good metric to help you define how well that's occurring in your organization. So we spent a little bit of time on this slide. I think these are 4 baseline benchmarks that allow you to make some adjustment on it. We've all seen the 7-20-10 split. This is a definition, as far as a general definition, as far as learning that needs to happen in the workplace. The 70-20-10 is a good split, I think, to start for folks. So you have 70% of learning occurs through on-the-job experiences, 20% from informal or self-directed learning, and we have a solution called ThinkBox, which allows micro-learning to happen at your desk, your phone, or wherever. And then the other 10% comes from more formal learning, like education. Now, I'm one that may get a little fumed by seeing that I have 10 years of education under my belt, and its value is 10% in the organization. The good news is it's what I bring to the table anyways, where 70% comes from. So I guess that's on the bright side. But think about that. How many MBA, EMBA, and other kinds of programs do you throw? This is what we do for high potentials, keeping in mind the value of that education, which is still good. That value is only going to see a 10% uptick in performance in the workplace versus 70% coming from on-the-job experiences. 20% is great. It's informal learning like coaching, mentoring, and then what I do at my desk, things like ThinkBox. So those are just some caveats in there to think about when you're creating developmental opportunities, where you're putting weight, as well as financial resources, and you're building really the structure of these opportunities. So I think it's a dramatic shift in where people spend money, and it needs to be probably managed better in higher compensation than it is for really ridiculous external programs. So it's just something to pay attention to. We're going to move on to our next poll question. It's up on the screen, and as I bring it up, you should see it there. So what types of tools do you use to help with succession planning? You have 9-box or some sort of plotting. Some people do a 2x2 or a 4x1. I've seen all numerous things, but most often it's a 9-box. Are you using career development plans for everyone? Assessments such as 360s or personality inventories and surveys to define strengths and challenges. Or just competency mapping, which is more of a baseline consideration. So we'll give it a minute or so. We've nearly got half of everyone on there voting, so that's great. So give just a few more seconds, everyone. We'll close this out, and we'll take a look what everyone's doing. All right, so as far as a lead tool, solution, and process, most of you are using a 9-box or some form of plotting. Like I had mentioned, you can do 2x2 instead of 3x3, and I've even seen some that do the 9-box experience, but 70% of the people are considered high potential out of 100, which is wrong. So what an HR expert will do is then take the 70% and redo a whole new 9-box, treating everyone as highly valued to further flesh that out. So you end up with, a 9x9, and it gets really unwieldy. But the idea is the 9-box may not be the end-all be-all, but you got to further factor people and flesh them out. Career development plans for everyone. That's great. That means not just people in a succession plans. So it means you're highly valued, you're highly valued. We're kind of getting to Oprah a little bit and just pointing fingers and saying everyone's great. And that's good for culture, provided that you can actually do it and follow through. And when I say you, I'm talking about you business, you company. You have to truly value everyone, promote them as people, and value them by giving them various opportunities, not just your high potentials. The assessments in 360s, I find this to be the most tangible because these products are readily available online. And they just take a credit card, you buy them, you have inventory, you use them and leverage them. And businesses are used to them. 360s, at least some of the data that I've seen from various research organizations, 90 to 92% of almost every business in the world is using some form of feedback tool to help inform things like leadership development and succession planning. So that just lets me know the availability of these products online. And then competency mapping, which is great to see. I wish I would see it a little bit higher on there, because without that, you're just doing assessments. But how are you mapping that to what's vital to the business in relation to the development plans of those leaders that are considered high potentials? So this is great. It's a good way, I think, to help everyone that's joined us this morning, just to see how you and your peers are using a lot of these different tools in succession planning. So I'm going to close this out and get us back on track to our slides. So as we look at data for the sake of measurement, you can look at both the individual as well as team. Leaders are not leaders of process. That's what experts are for. Subject matter experts. Leaders are leaders of people. So that's where teams come in. So it's something to really really pay attention to as far as some of the inventory surveys and feedback tools that are out there, that you're also measuring their team and how well they're performing as far as a team perspective. So if you were to take a look at ThinkWise, we highly value 360s. Our 360 is highly configurable across our competency library of over 22 global competencies, and that'll allow you to leverage 62 supporting competencies or critical behaviors. It gives you ability to define those 2 to 3 that are really critical when you have such a varied library. So the competencies are best used when you map them to either 1, your strategy as a business, or 2, your leadership expectations. If you select competencies from one or two of those perspectives, you're going to be highly successful, I think, from a 360 perspective. The ThinkWise Team Performance Survey is great because it's going to survey the latest research-supported dimensions of a highly effective and a highly functioning team, from dimensions like communication to team process. So the results, I think, are valued because they actually will matter. It asks the entire team, how well are we doing, and it has an us or a collective perspective versus Steve said this about John, or Deb doesn't like Sue. It's not going to get into that. It's going to get into rating how well we're doing as a team, and it gives everyone an opportunity to provide that information anonymously. It also is going to give you some next steps on how to leverage some of the strengths of the team that have been identified, as well as highlight some action steps on some of the roadblocks that were identified on that survey too. Once you have assessments and you've gone through kind of the diagnostic process, ThinkWise was always wondering what's next as far as assessments and tools that are out there. We've all taken a lot of tools that have either said we love the color blue, I'm a giraffe versus a zebra, or that I'm very dominant and I don't communicate well. Those things are good from one perspective, but we staple them and we put them in a drawer, right? I mentioned that junk drawer earlier. So for ThinkWise, we said, what's next? So once assessments and that diagnostic process is finished, we believe that microlearning helps drive the next step and address some pitfalls that most assessments have. We all have taken like an assessment, like I've mentioned, and we wondered, now what do I do with it? So ThinkWise is proud to say that we're the first ones to address that next step, really from a linear perspective. Once you've had your assessments done, they've highlighted your strengths and some of your challenges, our micro-learning is mapped to that information, and it's a really easy, quick next step to figure out some micro-learning tools that are out there just to help people with some of those pitfalls in their development planning. So we have a little bit of time for some Q&A, and I want to open that up to other folks. Go ahead and use your chat function that's there. Go ahead and fire away a few things, and we'll answer them as they come through. So I have one question as far as related to 360s, and it's asking about risks related to quality of response and how do you solve quality of response. I don't have all day on that one because that's a huge question, and I think it's an important one. As far as the quality of responses are concerned, I think you need to balance that in your organization. When you're setting up 360s, you need to have the participant, and that may be your high potential, help decide who some of those raters are. I think HR needs to be involved on who some of those raters are, as well as that high pose upline. That upline should help, if not even approve, who the raters need to be, because you really need a balance of peers, downlines, the upline, and in some search situations, even consumers. And even if you're not a consumer-based organization, every leader has a consumer inside of a business unit, right? So like for example, the sales team, one of their consumers may be R&D. as far as informing what the consumer is saying about products. That feedback should be going back to R&D as well, so there's a relationship. So I think one way to, I wouldn't use the word solve, but one way to help quality of response is making sure HR is involved, as well as that upline as a sponsor as far as picking those raters out. So that's a great question as far as quality. Is the 360 available in various languages? Yes. It's actually available in over 100 different languages. And when you purchase our 360s and you go through the setup process, there's a drop-down window asking you to select which language you want that in. So one thing that's pretty neat, if you're actually headquarters in, let's say, the United States, so HR is doing the administration in native English, but the participant is in Germany and they prefer German as their language, that rater can select their own language for them. So the HR doesn't need to admin who gets what language. And let's say they have a coach that speaks French. They can select their own language as well. So the language is set up there as well in that solution. How do you manage the downside of labeling people as hypos? So that's open to a little bit of an interpretation. So, so labeling people as high potential, on one hand, is they should be told. You don't hide that from folks that they're high potential because they know that they're doing a great job. And if they think they're doing a great job and they're not being treated as such, they will leave. You don't completely alleviate it, but you do alleviate some by at least telling them and acknowledging that. The downside is if they, it goes to their head and they start to gloat a little bit. Well, right away, that gives you more diagnostic information. And if you're a consultant or you're internal HR or you're on the call here and you're an executive, that type of gloat, you have to make a decision if that is something you want in your leader. And if it is not, you can help alleviate that a little bit by informing that person first, working with them about the negative realities of gloating that you're a high potential and how that can come across to peers and downlines. And then over time, if you don't see improvement, it's your decision on what you do with the 9 box. Whether or not you want to consider them a high potential still. It's not a category that you're a high potential forever. So it's something you always have to work on to be considered high potential. And then as we wrap up, for an ineffective leadership team, is it better to begin with the 360 tool or the team performance tool? So as far as a team is concerned, I would start with the team product. You need to evaluate what the whole team is saying about the us and the collective first, because there may be more issues that are happening and rampant across the team than one individual. I hate to use the word fix, but I can, resolve some issues with one particular leader, but if I always set them on fire, they're not going to be successful. So I would take a broader perspective and look at the team on that one. So that was a great question, though. If we have more questions as we wrap up, we can respond to you guys individually through email and following up. And then as we wrap up, Heath, I'm going to pass it on to you and let you close out for us. Okay. I just want to say thank you to everyone for being on the call, and we'll be in touch shortly, I'm sure.
Great, thanks, Steve. That was a great presentation. Following this session, we will follow up with emails to all of the folks who signed on. We'll send you a link to the recorded version of the webinar, as well as a downloadable version of the slides. And then we'll also follow up with some other communications on future webinars that are coming up and some additional resources for you for participating today. And some additional promotional items as well. So again, thanks everybody for attending, and we will talk to you again real soon. Thanks.
Take care, guys.